Jim Bob Duggar has run for elected office 4 times. He served as an Arkansas state legislator. He tried to become a U.S. senator. He has sat in rooms with governors, with White House officials, with conservative Christian political leaders from coast to coast. He built a commercial real estate empire in Northwest Arkansas. He raised 19 children, all homeschooled, all given names starting with J, all kept within a world controlled almost entirely by him. He is not a simple country preacher with a big family. He is a man who spent 30 years constructing something financial, political, theological, and familial that kept every single person inside it dependent on him to survive. And now, for the second time in 4 years, a son produced by that structure has been charged against a child. This is not bad luck. This is not a coincidence. This is what happens when a system designed to protect one man's image fails the most vulnerable people inside it. And today, we are going to walk through exactly how it was built, exactly how it failed, and exactly what is left of it now. Let's start with something most people overlook when they think about Jim Bob Duggar. Before the reality show, before the matching outfits and the quiverful theology and the bus tours, there was a politician. From 1999 to 2003, Jim Bob served in the Arkansas House of Representatives for District 6. He was not just a backbencher. He was vice chair of the House Corrections and Criminal Law Subcommittee. Read that again. The man who would later handle his own son's abuse of 5 underage girls entirely internally, without police, without prosecution, without any real accountability, sat on the committee that oversees corrections and criminal law in the state of Arkansas. He knew how the system worked. He knew what reporting requirements looked like. He knew what consequences were supposed to happen. And when the moment came for him to apply any of that knowledge to his own family, he chose not to. That choice was not ignorance. It was decision-making by someone who understood exactly what he was deciding. After his House term, Jim Bob did not quietly return to private life. He ran for U.S. Senate in 2002 and lost badly, pulling just over 20,000 votes against an incumbent. Then in 2006, he ran for Arkansas State Senate District 35 and came within 200 votes of winning. 200 votes. He nearly made it back, and he kept going. In 2021, while his son Josh was sitting in a federal courtroom awaiting trial on child Jim Bob Duggar announced another Senate run. He ran on being pro-family, pro-business, pro-gun, and pro-life. He said he was tried and tested in the public spotlight and never changed. He lost in the Republican primary in December 2021, the same month Josh was convicted. He ran for Senate while his son was on trial for possessing child. He ran on a pro-family platform while a federal jury was deciding his eldest child's fate. The audacity in that is not incidental. It tells you everything about how Jim Bob sees himself. In his mind, he is still the protagonist. He is still a good guy. The empire he built is justified because he built it, and no amount of evidence to the contrary has ever cracked that belief. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the control becomes concrete. Jim Bob is not a pastor. He is a commercial real estate investor who happened to also serve in the Arkansas House for 4 years. He started 2 small businesses early on, sold them, and pivoted to real estate, which became the financial engine of everything. The family compound in Tontitown, Arkansas, is not simply a house where a lot of people live. It is a multi-property network. Adult Duggar children live on land connected to Jim Bob's holdings. When you look at where Joseph and his wife Kendra were living before his arrest, on Silver Birch Street in Tontitown, inside the orbit of that same compound, you are looking at a pattern, not a coincidence. Adult children in Duggar-adjacent housing, working in Duggar-adjacent businesses, embedded in a financial ecosystem where leaving is not just emotionally difficult, but economically devastating. Joseph himself had a real estate license. He was working in a space directly tied to the family business world Jim Bob constructed. That license, by the way, is set to expire at the end of 2026, and a conviction on the current charges would almost certainly end it permanently. This is the architecture of dependency. Homeschooling meant no outside school, no peer networks beyond the family, no credential that functions cleanly in the broader world. The courtship rules Jim Bob enforced meant he controlled who his children could pursue relationships with. Reports from people close to the family describe him as treating marriages like business deals, approving matches, managing the process, keeping everything inside the network. Housing flows through family property. Employment flows through family business connections. Even the church the family attends is tied to a specific theological community, one where leaving theology means losing the community, which means losing the network, which means starting over with nothing. Every single system in a Duggar child's life was designed, whether consciously or not, to make leaving feel impossible. And for a long time, it worked. The cameras kept rolling, the books kept selling, the speaking circuit kept paying, and the whole machine kept moving forward on the fuel of a carefully curated image. But here is where the story breaks open, because the image was always a lie, and Jim Bob knew it. In the early 2000s, when Josh Duggar was between 14 and 15 years old, he molested 5 underage girls. The victims included members of his own family. Jim Bob handled it internally. He sent Josh to a family friend for a counseling program that was not a licensed therapeutic program. He eventually did report it to law enforcement, but the way he did it tells you exactly what he thought accountability was supposed to look like. He took Josh to Arkansas State Trooper Jim Hutchins, a personal family acquaintance, for what was described as a stern talk. No charges were filed. Hutchins took no further action. Jim Bob called this handling it. Jim Bob called this accountability. For years, he pointed to this moment as evidence that the family had faced the situation seriously and moved on. What he never mentioned, what the public did not find out until much later, was that Jim Hutchins, the trooper he trusted with his son's abuse case, was himself later convicted on child charges and sentenced to 56 years in prison. Hutchins also later alleged that the Duggar family had made efforts to conceal the full extent of Josh's abuse. So to review, Jim Bob Duggar reported his son's molestation of 5 children to a police officer who turned out to be a predator himself, an officer who helped them bury it. And for years, Jim Bob held that up as proof that his family had done the right thing. The system of accountability he relied on was rotten at its foundation, and he either did not know it or did not care. When the story became public in 2015, sparked by a leaked police report, the media coverage was intense. TLC pulled the show temporarily, then brought it back in a modified form. Jim Bob and Michelle gave a carefully managed interview. They talked about forgiveness, they talked about healing, they talked about how the family had handled a painful situation with grace and God's guidance. The victims were largely kept out of the conversation. The framing was entirely about what the Duggars had survived, not what had been done to the children inside their own home. And it worked, at least for a while. The show kept going, the brand kept generating income, the political aspirations stayed alive, the cover-up was held. Then came 2021. Federal agents searched the Duggar family car lot. Josh was arrested on charges of receiving and possessing. The trial happened, the jury convicted him. He was sentenced to more than 12 years in federal prison. Jim Bob and Michelle sat in the courtroom. They attended a church event the night before the verdict. They showed up, they stayed. And when Josh was convicted, Jim Bob issued a statement expressing disappointment in the outcome. Not in his son's actions, in the outcome. The language of a man who still believed the problem was the exposure, not the behavior. Now here is where we arrive at the present, because the empire that survived Josh's conviction is now facing something it may not survive. Joseph Duggar, the 5th-born child, the one who was part of the family's second wave of spin-off content, the one who built a whole separate public profile with his wife Kendra and their children, was arrested in early 2025 on charges related to the alleged molestation of a 9-year-old child. Alleged conduct that reportedly began during a family vacation in 2020. A 9-year-old on a family vacation. And the alleged conduct reportedly continued for a period of time after that. The child who came forward was not protected by the Duggar accountability system. She was protected by her own father, who acted independently, hired his own investigator, and went to police himself. The family's network did not surface this. The church community did not surface this. The internal mechanisms Jim Bob spent 30 years building did not surface this. One father, operating entirely outside the Duggar structure, is the reason there is a case at all. Think about that timeline. 2020 is when the alleged conduct began. 2025 is when the arrest happened. 5 years. 5 years during which, according to everything we know about how this family operates, the priority would have been managing the information rather than protecting the child. The victim in this case is not a Duggar. She has a father who is not embedded in the dependency structure, who had not traded his independence for access to the family network, who had nothing to lose by going to the police. That independence is the reason this case exists, and it throws into sharp relief what happened every other time something like this surfaced inside the family's orbit, which is that the people who could have acted were all too intertwined with Jim Bob's world to do it. And then there is Kendra. Kendra Caldwell Duggar, Joseph's wife, was arrested in March of 2025 on charges unrelated to the abuse allegations. After her arrest, it was not her own mother who came to get her out. It was Michelle Duggar. Michelle, who has spent 30 years smiling for cameras, who built a brand on maternal warmth and Christian domesticity, who co-authored books about raising godly children, drove to the jail, posted Kendra's bond, and got into a physical altercation with a paparazzo who was trying to document the moment on camera. Michelle Duggar fought a photographer. The woman whose public spokesperson issued exactly 5 words of public comment about the child victim in Joseph's case, and those 5 words were, "Our hearts break for her," had the energy to physically confront a member of the press when the cameras were capturing something she did not control. That image is the Duggar family's relationship with the media in one scene. They have always understood cameras as tools, curated access when it builds the brand, physical resistance when it reveals something real. But notice something else about that moment. It was Michelle who bailed Kendra out, not Kendra's own mother, not a friend from outside the family, Michelle. Because of Kendra's family, the Caldwells are currently in the process of being pushed out of the Duggar orbit. Paul Caldwell, Kendra's father, is reportedly the one family in this extended network who is never fully absorbed into the dependency structure Jim Bob built. The Caldwells maintained a degree of independence, and that independence is exactly why they are able to publicly stand with the victim, to make statements that diverge from the Duggar party line, to not circle the wagons. Everyone else who has publicly supported Joseph or stayed silent has something to lose. The Caldwells, having kept enough distance from the financial and social web Jim Bob constructed, have the freedom to act according to their conscience. That contrast between the people inside the machine and the people just outside it tells you more about how the machine functions than any individual scandal ever could. Meanwhile, the broader infrastructure supporting all of this is collapsing in slow motion. The Institute in Basic Life Principles, the umbrella organization that gave the Duggar theology its structure, its community, its national network of like-minded families, was already weakened after its founder, Bill Gothard, resigned in 2014 following a wave of abuse allegations. The IBLP's Joshua Generation Project, the explicit goal of raising children who would infiltrate and take over government, media, and culture, has been quietly set aside as the flagship family of that movement has produced instead a federal convict and a man now facing molestation charges. TLC pulled the show in 2021, and it is not coming back. Jim Bob's political career is over, not because he chose to step away, but because no Republican primary in Arkansas is putting his name on a ballot after 2 sons were charged with offenses involving children. The speaking circuit, the book deals, the conference appearances, the Christian media ecosystem that amplified the Duggar message for 2 decades. All of it is either gone or going. What is left is property, money, lawyers, and 19 children at various stages of a reckoning that is playing out in public in real time. Some of them are breaking free. Jana Duggar, the eldest daughter, who spent years as the family's unpaid domestic manager, has quietly created some distance. Jill Duggar and her husband Derek Dillard have been publicly vocal about the control Jim Bob exercised over their finances and their lives, including revelations that Jill and Derek were not compensated for years of filming that generated enormous income for Jim Bob. Jessa and Ben Seawald remain closer to the family orbit. Joyanna and Austin Forsyth are somewhere in between. And then there is Josh, sitting in federal prison. serving a sentence that will keep him there until his children are approaching adulthood. The pattern inside this family's history is now undeniable. In 2003, abuse happened, and Jim Bob handled it internally. In 2006, he reported it to a police contact who was himself later convicted and called that accountability. In 2020, alleged abuse of a child outside the family reportedly began. No one reports it for 5 years. In 2025, an arrest happened not because the Duggar accountability system worked, but because one man outside that system refused to let it be buried. The only time in this family's entire documented history that justice moved forward was when someone acted independently, outside the network Jim Bob built. Every single internal mechanism failed, every single time. There is a line Jim Bob used repeatedly in his political campaigns. He said he had been tried and tested in the public spotlight and never changed. He meant it as a compliment to himself. He was right, though, in a way he probably did not intend. He has not changed. The man who covered up abuse in 2003 is the same man who ran for Senate in 2021. The man who reported his son to a corrupt police officer and called it accountability is the same man whose spokesperson issued 5 words about a child victim in 2025. He has not changed. The empire has not changed. The only thing that has changed is the number of times it has failed the people it was supposed to protect. The Duggar family has spent 30 years telling America that they had the answers, that their model of family, large, homeschooled, controlled, insulated, theologically rigid, produced something better than the culture around them. They sold that message on television, in books, on the speaking circuit, in political campaigns. They sold it to millions of people who bought the DVDs and the merchandise and the devotion. And what that model actually produced, what it reliably, consistently, structurally produced, is a family where abusers were protected, victims were managed, children were kept too dependent to speak, and accountability was performed rather than practiced. That is the legacy. Not 19 children with J names, not a real estate portfolio in Northwest Arkansas, not 4 failed Senate campaigns. The legacy is what happened to the kids who couldn't leave, and what happened to the people who tried to tell the truth before anyone was ready to hear it. The empire is crumbling. The question is not whether it collapses. The question is whether it collapses before it does more damage to the people still inside it. The children who are still young, the daughters-in-law who are still embedded, the grandchildren who are growing up in compounds connected to Jim Bob's property. The cameras are still watching. The lawyers are still working. And Jim Bob Duggar, who genuinely believes he is the good guy in this story, has still not changed.